Okay, thank you everybody for attending today. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dr. Carl Windsor. I'm Senior Vice President of Product Technologies and Solutions at Fortinet. I'm also our product CISO. And like any good product manager or CISO, I'm bringing a lot of people here onto stage to help me do my job. And take credit for it at the end probably as well, knowing how these things work. So I'd like to introduce, we've got a really great esteemed panel here today who are going to be talking with us. We have on the far side there, Suzanne Spaulding, former Undersecretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Eric Goldstein, the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, or CISA as we all know. And then last but not least, Michael Daniel, President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. So for starters, starting with Suzanne, can we give a little bit about your background and what you're doing now and why you're interested in the topics we're talking about today?
Sure, Carl. Thanks. Great to be here. I guess I first started paying attention to cyber as a risk to our critical infrastructure back in the mid-90s. With the Marsh Commission and the President's Critical Infrastructure Protection Panel. Probably, Michael, you're the only one in the room who knows what I'm talking about. And my friend Lee Zeichner, who taught me more about cybersecurity than I'm sure I've forgotten. And as I watched the evolution then, particularly within government, of an understanding of the severity of the threat that cyber presented to critical infrastructure, watched the sort of creation of little nascent centers of excellence within government, way back in the late 90s and early 2000s over at DOJ and other places, and then of course the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, where it was for the first time really made a significant part of the mission and one of the only new parts of that mission. I worked largely in the intelligence community, both at CIA and as General Counsel for the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, and in private practice, including advising critical infrastructure companies, and then became the Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security, where I had the honor of working with outstanding men and women like Jim Reichberg and Eric Goldstein and many others, some of whom are here in this room, who work every day to strengthen the security and resilience of our nation's critical infrastructure. And now I'm Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Eric?
All right, very briefly, I'm Eric Goldstein. I lead cybersecurity at CISA, which is America's civilian cyber defense agency. Looking forward to the conversation.
And finally, Michael.
So I'm Michael Daniel. I'm currently President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is a nonprofit information sharing, cyber threat intelligence sharing organization made up of cybersecurity providers. Prior to that, I spent over 20 years in the US government, large part in all of that in the national security world, both at the Office of Management and Budget, and then finally as 4.5 years as the cybersecurity coordinator for the US government from 2012 to 2017.
Okay, so thank you very much to everybody. Before we start, I'd just like to take a few moments to say thank you to Eric, CISA in general, and Director Easterly, just for all of the work that you've been doing to help secure our cybersecurity across the nation. We know, as Fortinet ourselves, we want to work very closely with you to help secure the nation's cybersecurity, and it allows us, the work that you're doing and the participation we have with you, and then the reciprocity of all of the new standards that you're driving with things like the Secure by Design pledge is really helping to secure the industry and everybody in this room. So I'd just like to take a few seconds, if everybody, just be a bit of a round of applause to Eric and CISA. Now, the good news there is I'll be editing that applause at the end of the video as well, so it makes to make this session look even better, so thank you. This session today is a favorite topic of mine, the importance of transparency in cybersecurity. And to set the stage for this conversation, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the research that our FortiGuard threat research team has been doing into CVEs and vulnerabilities. At the end of this year, or so beginning of this year, we're seeing that CVs are being exploited now in under 5 days. That's gone down. It's gone down from roughly 8 days at the beginning of 2023. So what you can see is that cyber actors are organizing very rapidly. They're looking to take advantage of the vulnerabilities that are out there. And this means that we need to organize ourselves much more rapidly. We need to take the advice from the vendors to upgrade, from organizations like CISA and other organizations like the Network Resilience Coalition. So it's really important to maintain the security of our networks that we're paying attention. And I'm glad to see you all here today. So today's panel is going to focus on transparency in cybersecurity and how that plays into trust that you have in the products and the vendors that you have on your network. So my first question here is for Eric. We've seen that CISA has been joined with various different international partners to call out to industry to embrace radical transparency and accountability, as was seen in yesterday's Secure by Design pledge signing. As one of the first vendors to sign that pledge yesterday, we understand the importance of this effort, but can you share more on why you believe this is so important?
Absolutely, and let's just start by reflecting on why radical transparency was one of the fundamental pillars of the Secure by Design initiative that CISA kicked off a year ago, driving the imperative of the national cybersecurity strategy to shift the balance of accountability to those tech providers who can best bear it. Cybersecurity ultimately is less of a technology discipline than a decision science, right? It is the science, if we are doing this work correctly, to determine how we use, manage, develop, and control technology in a way that maximizes benefits while reducing risks. But the challenge in cybersecurity, unlike most other disciplines, is we lack the data and the rigor to be able to make risk decisions in a repeatable, reliable way. And that is largely due to one foundational challenge, which is we lack data about both why negative cyber events happen, but also whether the technologies we are using are designed in a way that is safe and secure. And that is because we have a historic culture in technology generally where transparency is almost counter-normative, where you use a piece of technology and you simply trust that it will work safely and securely as designed, and you recognize that there is some degree of risk being externalized onto the customer, but you are unable to actually estimate, not to mention quantify, what that risk looks like. That is an intolerable position for any enterprise. It's an intolerable position for our country as a whole. And so the idea behind radical transparency is for every technology provider to be extremely open with their customers, first and foremost, about the safety and security condition of their products, including rapidly disclosing fully enriched CVEs for vulnerabilities, and then be transparent about the steps that they are taking to advance the security of their products so that customers can make an educated and informed risk decision, both tactically about how to reduce or manage the risk of the products they are relying on, and then strategically to understand the balance between products, the balance between vendors, the balance between using a particular product in a way that meets their balance between risk and benefit, and also allows us to aggregate that analysis and understand risk to our critical functions and our nation as a whole.
Brilliant, thank you. Suzanne, through your lens of working at DHS, can you share why you think radical transparency and responsible transparency is so important? And I've heard you speak previously about learning to fight in the light, and that's exactly a core tenet of what we're trying to communicate here. So I'd really like to hear from you. Why is this a win-win for the industry and for customers?
Yeah, I really can't tell you how excited I was when I saw CISA pushing this notion of radical transparency. Again, sort of going back to ancient history. In 2010, I wrote a blog entitled No More Secrets, in which I talked about the fact that the shelf life of secrets is vanishingly short. that this idea that you can keep any information closely held or secret, or that your adversaries or competitors aren't going to find that same information, was rapidly becoming really a myth, and that a transparent world is coming at us full steam ahead. If you think about the direct costs of keeping secrets reflected in the billions of dollars worth of industry here at RSA, right? Focused on trying to keep information secret. And then what we've been talking about here today, which is the opportunity costs of thinking you can keep information secret and not sharing that information, which we saw so clearly after 9/11, right? When we realized that we had failed to share with people who could help to prevent that or keep us safe and mitigate those disasters, the opportunity cost of trying to hold that information close. If you train to fight in the dark, you could meet your adversary at night or turn off the lights and you'd have the advantage, right? I think of the daredevil, right? Instead, we have a world in which lights are being turned on all the time, right? That's that transparent world where it's harder and harder to keep things secret in the dark, right? So whoever can train to fight in the light, whoever can train to fight in that transparent environment, to compete in that transparent environment, is going to have the advantage. That's just the reality. And the good news is democracies have an advantage there because we're used to that, whereas our adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, they need those dark corners to hide secrets from their populations, right? We should be flipping on lights. We can flip on lights and get the benefits of sharing that information. Our adversaries are sharing information. They know what techniques work and which techniques don't, right? They know what kind of targets pay and which don't, et cetera. We need to be doing the same thing, and that's this notion of radical transparency. And we need to make the market work better. We have come to understand the market can't get us all the way where we need to be on cyber. So we can't depend on the market, but we can't abandon it. And the market needs data to be efficient. It needs that information in order to be efficient. That radical transparency is essential to have the market work in an efficient way.
And finally, Michael, so your perspective, you've got some good industry side experience, but why do you think radical transparency is important?
Well, I think for anybody that works in Washington, I mean, one of the sayings that we always have is that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? So if you're trying to actually get rid of bugs, using sunlight on them, transparency helps with that. But I also think that when you think about how the bad guys do what they do, right, they rely on the fact that once you get an exploit for a vulnerability, you can use it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? And so the more rapidly that we get information out about vulnerabilities and how to fix them, the faster we actually propagate that information out across the community, the lower we can make the return for the bad guys. And particularly for the criminal actors, this is all about actually making it more costly for them to do their business, right? On the other hand, we also want to make the nation state actors, we want to make them burn those 0 days so that they actually have to expend resources and give up secrets in order to achieve their goals at a much higher and faster rate. So again, it increases the cost for them. So it adds friction to the system. So that's why we, at CTA, we embrace this idea of transparency. So for example, when you share information through CTA, while we protect customer information, and our members like Fortinet don't send us customer information, all the information that is shared remains tagged to the submitter. So you can always know where that source of information came from and who stands behind it. So we very much embrace that idea of transparency, no anonymity inside CTA among the members.
Yeah. So we talked now about why transparency is important, but Can each of you share what you think transparency means? So for the vendors in the room and for customers, who are having to, the vendors who are implementing and the customers who are now adopting products that are adhering to these standards, what does good mean when it comes to transparency? So starting with Suzanne.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've heard talked about in this is a modification of the radical transparency to say responsible radical transparency, which I always chuckle at because responsible radical seems to me a bit of an oxymoron. But in fact, that is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a degree of transparency that is sort of unprecedented, but that is nevertheless responsible. And what do we mean by that? Of course, what we mean by that is you want to get vulnerability information out to your customers as quickly as you can once you have developed some mitigation steps that your customers can take, particularly given that 5-day window that we now sort of on average know that the bad guys can so quickly exploit those vulnerabilities. So, and obviously sort of that notion of coordinated disclosure, companies working with outside researchers in a collaborative manner, encouraging the research that helps to find those vulnerabilities and working together to get that word out to as widely as possible, as quickly as possible in that responsible way. So I think that's certainly one aspect.
So I would differentiate between process transparency and outcome transparency. And when we think about process transparency, that is really, what does your security program look like? And I think we've actually gotten decent as an industry in creating an expectation that vendors will articulate at a reasonable level to their customers, what does their security program look like? What is their control environment? What is their build process? There have been important steps from the US government like NIST's Secure Software Development Framework, like the recent software security attestation form that all providers of software to his government now have to attest to, that really focus on that process transparency. Are you doing the right things that can reasonably be expected to lead to pro-security outcomes? We still have work to do on outcome transparency. And what that means is there a risk condition in a product that may change a customer's own risk tolerance or risk environment? And so the easiest example, of course, is the disclosure of identified vulnerabilities. And as Suzanne well noted, part of the issue is the decision of whether or not to disclose. And it is CISA's strong belief that every vulnerability should be disclosed, whether or not it requires customer action, and that includes software providers, hardware providers, SaaS providers, cloud providers, every vulnerability, every time, but also what is disclosed. And far too often, vulnerabilities are disclosed with the barest minimum of information. And that poses some real challenges, because one of the key aspects of the Secure by Design pledge that Dr. Windsor mentioned is this idea of eliminating classes of vulnerabilities. But when CISA did some research to try to analyze over 40,000 vulnerabilities in the CVE database to actually assess which classes of vulnerabilities, which we usually enumerate using CWEs, are most prevalent, we couldn't do it, because so many vulnerabilities have no CWE enrichment with their listing. And so therefore, if we say we as an ecosystem want to move to more secure products, and we think that these classes of vulnerabilities are either most prevalent or most impactful, today we lack the data to do that analysis to drive the right investment. And so, as so often happens in cybersecurity, we revert back to anecdotes rather than empiricism. So making sure that we have timely disclosure and complete disclosure is a key step towards that outcome transparency.
Yeah, I would actually say that when I think about it, I will actually use a word that doesn't come naturally to the cybersecurity industry, which is humility. The idea that we understand that there are vulnerabilities in all software products, in all hardware products. No one actually has discovered a way to write bug-free software yet. Now, once they do, then great. Maybe then we can have an argument about, somebody actually marketing themselves as actually having, completely secure software or hardware. But until we get to that world, everybody has that. And so I think having a little bit of humility about your products, about the outcomes, so that you can embrace the fact that everyone is in this together. And that also means embracing the fact that you actually work together as a community to eliminate and patch these vulnerabilities, not as trying to use it as some sort of competitive wedge, because today may be your turn, or today may be somebody else's turn, but next week is your turn, right? And that we all want to be able to raise the level of cybersecurity across the entire ecosystem, and we want to be competing on other things. Now, someday I hope to live in a world where we've actually really got this locked down, and you can actually say, yes, some vendors actually have better security processes and produce more secure software or hardware than others. I want to get to that world, but we're certainly not there yet.
Although I do think the Secure by Design framework and pledge, for example, is a step, certainly a significant step in that direction.
We're finally on that path, but
Right.
that's going to take years to get
Well,
there. So we got plenty of time to practice this transparency
Yeah.
part.
And to your point about, that we haven't yet figured out how to write 100% secure code, the other implication of that, of course, what that should tell you is if you've got a vendor that is not with some regularity telling you about vulnerabilities they're finding, it's not because they're not finding vulnerabilities, right? And I thought CISA did a really nice job in the Secure by Design pledge and the framework to emphasize this point. I remember, Eric, when we first rolled out the technology for the .gov, that would give us greater visibility into what was going on the network. And we warned everybody, including Congress, it's going to look ugly at first. You're going to think that suddenly .gov security has gone down, when in fact, we are enhancing .gov security because we are finding things and disclosing things that used to be hidden. Exactly. Right. And the same is true, I think. You cannot look at, oh, this company has disclosed more vulnerabilities than this company, therefore this company has more vulnerabilities, is not the logical conclusion there. It may well be that what you're getting then is a company that is promptly disclosing what everybody else is also finding.
Yeah. And that's really good, and that brings us into the next question, which is for vendors who are not disclosing internal discovered vulnerabilities, what is the risk that brings if they're not doing that, if they're not disclosing in an open manner the same way as they would third-party discoveries? So what kind of issue does that bring? Because if you think of vendors who are doing that, maybe that has a negative impact on, you've mentioned already, on their PR, whereas the other vendors are not maybe playing on a level playing field. So what does that bring?
There's the risk to the customers, obviously, and we've seen this. We've seen this play out. One of the things that a lot of companies do is they will sort of bury that vulnerability and the fix in the next round of updates that include all these wonderful new features, et cetera, right? And so you get this update and you apply the update, and you never know really that in there was a patch for a vulnerability that was found, maybe weeks ago. And we saw how badly that can play out. I mean, Eric, you guys saw it firsthand. When the bad guys find out about it and exploit it before that general update comes around. And then there's also the downside, as Eric said, for everyone who doesn't get the benefit of the deeper understanding that can come from that disclosure.
I think that's spot on. I'll just really amplify the second point, which is customers of technology products are largely unable to discriminate based on security because they lack data to do so. And so it would be as if I was buying a new minivan for my 3 small children, and I'm prioritizing safety, but I have no data to go with to actually understand if I am buying a safe vehicle. I am just going to buy the one with the shiniest paint job and the best speakers, because that is what the equivalent of what we have too often in security. And so making sure that we are enabling customers to discriminate based upon security outcomes, which then creates this virtuous cycle of a market incentive for better security. But today, living in our current environment largely of security opacity, customers are unable to make purchasing decisions based upon security outcomes, and therefore driving a disincentive for further transparency and further investment.
Yeah, and I also think you lose the opportunity to practice managing those vulnerabilities, right? That if you try to bury them, if you try to not find them, if you try to hide from that, you're not going to have the right processes, the right mindset to manage when those vulnerabilities inevitably appear. And so you'll be slower, you'll be less effective as an organization, whereas instead, if you've built the processes, to be transparent, then you know how to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we can see from what we've discussed so far is it's clear that the industry as a whole needs to almost regain the trust of our customers. We need to earn that trust again. So how can trust be built by vendors, and what can we do with regards to the way we build our products to try and re-earn that trust from our customers?
Well, I mean, I think, so I actually go back to a funny exchange I had with a reporter at one point. So there was a classified presidential decision document that governed a piece of cyber operations in the Obama administration. And we actually took the unusual step of acknowledging that this document existed, and we actually briefed the press on what the broad outlines of this document was, and we said, here's the process that it's going to entail, here's what it does, other sorts of things. This document was eventually leaked in the Snowden leaks. It made one little blip in the news and was then never heard from again. And I asked a reporter one time, like, why, this didn't get more coverage? And she said, because it said what you said it said. It was totally boring, right? In other words, there was no news there because we had been open about what was actually in the document, and the pieces that had been retained to be classified weren't actually all that interesting to sort of the broader public because they were about specific operational details. And so the lesson that you can take from that, right, is mean what you say what you mean, and actually follow through on that. And if you don't know, you don't know. And so rather than trying to dodge questions or make up answers, embracing what you know, what you don't know, and being consistently transparent over time actually pays dividends, because that's how you build trust, because people can come to rely on what you say.
I think if we reflect back at CISA's initial Secure by Design white paper and guidance from a year ago, most of it was uncontroversial, and people said this seems reasonable and directionally right, looking forward to hearing how we're actually going to apply it. One of the aspects of the guidance that actually was a little bit controversial in some technology provider circles is this concept of vendors being accountable for their customer security outcomes, which is actually a fairly orthogonal to how we actually generally approach security in the current day, where if there is a damaging intrusion affecting an enterprise victim, we collectively, the community, the media, the liability environment, puts accountability on the victim. And vendors far too often play along with that same narrative by saying, well, if only the victim had patched faster, then this never would have happened. And as noted in the opening, the time to exploit new vulnerabilities is dropping significantly. If 5 days is the average, we know actually a lot of vulnerabilities are exploited much more quickly, with a speed that, frankly, almost no organization is able to mitigate and patch in time. And so part of rebuilding trust is vendors being more accountable for harm affecting their customers based upon security weaknesses in the vendor's product. And that doesn't mean going on a global apology tour for every vulnerability, because as both Michael and Suzanne have noted, we haven't figured out how to create perfect software and perfect products yet, but it does mean changing the narrative to saying patch faster, patch harder is a failed model, and at the end of the day, intrusions occur, victims are created, because in many cases, they are victims in two dimensions. They are compromised by a malicious actor seeking to cause harm and violating federal law, and they are victimized by using a product that in some cases was not designed to be safe and secure by design and default. And vendors taking more of a victim supporting instead of victim blaming narrative can create that sense of shared accountability and shared fate, which can then help rebuild trust.
And we have that in a lot of contexts that you think about in your life. Tort liability, right? There is, the people who build and sell automobiles have a responsibility to provide you with a safe product, and you as a driver have a responsibility to drive safely and to fasten that seatbelt, et cetera. We don't have that working right now in the cybersecurity world because we have allowed these contracts from vendors in many instances, which say, you're buying this product, this service, and you are agreeing that we cannot be held responsible for any problems that you have. They are able to completely, by contract, absolve themselves of any liability.
It's actually even worse than that, right? You don't even get to buy the product. You're just licensing it.
Yeah.
It doesn't even belong to you.
Well, there is that. But I think and so we're starting to have some serious conversations, and the administration, the White House, leading some of these conversations about, how do we fix this to use what works in the rest of in other important parts of our lives, liability, implications, and accountability where accountability should rest, to help advance the development of more secure products and the prompt finding and disclosure of vulnerabilities all as part of that secure by design. And I think it's a really important conversation to be having. You cannot hold yourself out as a storage facility for when we all check out of our hotels, but we're not quite done, and we put our luggage in the storage facility at the hotel. You get a ticket and it says, we're not responsible if someone comes in and steals your suitcase. That is not binding, because we have a public policy that says if you hold yourself out as somebody who's going to securely take people's bags, you can't just wander off on your lunch break and leave the door open and then say we're not responsible if someone steals it. And that's the kind of thinking we need to bring into cybersecurity.
Yeah, and I think the Secure by Design pledge, building products securely by default and delivering them securely, and also taking the onus off the customer to configure boxes correctly. And then when things fail, everything inevitably fails. Have defense in depth to protect things that can protect the customer until they get the chance to update is incredibly important. And that kind of leads me on to the next question, which is clearly customers have a choice. They can look around, they can look to see which vendors they want to choose, and they can see who's signed up to the Secure by Design pledge. But what other standards should customers be looking for to government standards, best practices that they can look for to know that a vendor is doing the right thing in these kind of areas, and doing things in a robust manner and a Secure by Design manner and in a responsible, transparent manner?
This is really challenging because there are, in fact, no shortages of standards and frameworks and testing methodologies, and a walk around the expo floor downstairs will clearly reflect that every vendor articulates the myriad of standards and frameworks that they adhere to. The challenge is, A, which of those standards and frameworks actually lead to pro-security outcomes, and B, how can a customer actually understand if the vendor is doing the thing that they say that they are doing? That's one reason why we're so excited about the Secure by Design pledge, because if nothing else, it is understandable, it is clear, it is succinct. And so it is something where a customer can say, if nothing else, I know that my vendor has committed publicly to taking this specific set of practices that are demonstrably correlated with reducing some of the most prevalent kinds of attacks that we care most about. And it can't be the starting point, but we do feel that it constitutes that reasonable baseline of security outcomes that we want to achieve. And so if you combine the Secure by Design pledge with something like the NIST Software Security Development Framework that focuses more on that process transparency, that how do you build and design products, we think that is an appropriate way to begin to give customers a bit more assurance that at least their vendor is committed to doing the right thing.
Yeah, and I think we've struggled for years with this question of, sort of how do you measure cybersecurity-ness, right? And it's still a really hard problem. But there's starting to be some of these metrics out there that we know actually matter for organizations. And so things like, mean time between significant incidents, right? You want that number to be going down, right? Your mean time to be able to respond and contain an incident when it happens. We know that we want that time to be shrinking. And so, you can start to look at, are the products and services that you're using actually helping you, achieve some of those metrics. And then on the supply side, actually, can you actually see that they follow those best practices that we know are going to hang around? Like, we're not going to go back to a world where a default password is a good idea. Oh, and actually publishing that default password on your website so that users can find it. That is never going to be a good idea. So we know that there are practices that should be eliminated from processes, and you can look at whether or not those vendors, those suppliers are actually embracing those practices, those foundational practices that we know lead to better outcomes.
So follow-up question for Suzanne and Eric here. So what are government entities doing to help increase awareness, but also to make sure that more vendors are joining these practices, are adhering to good practices? Now, yesterday was, it was heartwarming to see, I think it was 67 people signing the Secure by Design pledge, but I'm sure that's a small fraction of the vendors that are out there. So what are we doing to drive good within the industry?
Yeah, I think the most important step that we can take, as Suzanne noted, within the voluntary environment that we have for technology security in this country, is to educate enterprise customers on the fact that the world can be different. The fact that security is a right, not a privilege. And there is a great paraphrased quote, which a lot of CISA speakers use, but I will use it for this audience in case you haven't heard it yet, which is when Ralph Nader was crusading for automobile security and the reduction of highway deaths. One of his most famous aphorisms was to create a world where there were fewer highway deaths and cars could be safer. The first thing that drivers had to do was actually believe that it was possible for cars to be safer. And before the advent of the seat belts and all of the other automotive safety innovations that succeeded it, it was simply, as Suzanne noted, it was widely regarded that when people died driving a car, it was because the driver didn't do a good job, and it actually required a massive shift in the Overton window to say, well, actually, no, that's part of the problem, but we can reduce automotive deaths exponentially if we make technology safety changes on the parts of the automobiles themselves. So the first thing we can do is educate consumers to say, actually, the fact that there are innumerable cybersecurity compromises every day, the fact that there are thousands of vulnerabilities being disclosed of the same class of vulnerabilities that we have known how to eliminate for decades, the fact that we generally cannot trust the products that we are using to have strong features for security by default without added cost, that doesn't have to be the world that we live in 5 or 10 years from now, and creating that mental model for customers to say, wait a second, I don't like this world. I don't like the model of cybersecurity we've built. I'm going to demand something different. We think that's the way to drive more adoption and more coalescence around companies to get them on board with the pledge and what comes next.
So I think it's it's brilliant and a really, really important transition and really dramatic shift in the way we think about this. The other thing I think that may seem somewhat surprising that I think we could do to improve the situation is to reinvigorate civics education in our country. And I'll explain how that connects. When the other common then NPPD, which was the predecessor to CISA, talking point was always, and I would, as the undersecretary, I'd stand in front of a crowded room full of ordinary people, small businesses, and I would say, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. And I would get these blank looks back from people, like, what is she talking about? And it dawned on me that part of the problem there was that people didn't understand this idea of civic responsibility, that you have a responsibility to something bigger than yourself. CISA has to find motivations in the marketplace where businesses see their self-interest in doing the right thing. But we have to go beyond that to a point where businesses see themselves as citizens, as responsible players in their community, in their nation, in the world, as global players. And I'm about to embark on a project to look at how we bring some of these civics concepts, like the sense of civic responsibility, into STEM education. I think it's critically important that our next generation of innovators, of tech experts, of the people who will fill rooms like this and convention halls like this, really come to this with a sense of the impact that their decisions and what they do can have on our world.
So to wrap up, and following on, I think the civics idea is really good. I don't think that's something, I'd love to see it happen in practice. I don't think that's something we can help with. But Eric, for you, what today can Fortinet do to help you achieve your goals? And for everybody in the audience, what can they do? What would you ask them to do as a takeaway?
Yeah. So if you are or work with a technology provider, there are two things. Make sure you have signed on to the Secure by Design pledge, but then that is only the first step. Then begin to communicate with that radical transparency about the specific steps that you are taking, where you are succeeding, where you are struggling, where you are seeing constraints across each of the activities in the pledge. If you are a technology consumer, which every single one of us are, create that demand signal for every single provider and vendor that you use to ask them, A, have you signed on to the Secure by Design pledge? B, how are you communicating transparently about what you are doing? And C, create the expectation that security is a right, not a privilege, and one to which every person's entitled.
And Carl, I'll just quibble with you a bit there. There is, in fact, every business, and this is what we're pushing for, can play a role in helping to sustain our democracy and bring us toward a more safe and secure world. And if this is of interest to you, check out Civics at Work at CSIS.org. Go to CSIS.org and search for Civics at Work. Businesses like Microsoft, Southern Company, and others, many others have stepped up in this regard. So
we will definitely have you in to talk about that at Fortinet, so thank you. Right, okay, so it's time to move to Q&A. So if anybody in the room has any questions, feel free. We have a microphone at the back there, yeah?
Hi, I'm a regulatory counsel with a publicly traded company, and we discuss the issues of liability versus the impossibility of completely protecting the enterprise and threading that needle. And I was curious your thoughts, mostly Eric and Suzanne, on how that might come about as we see more regulations coming from the government. Does it look like self-attestation? Like, what does that look like to allow for the fact that no enterprise is completely secure while also allowing for liability?
Yeah, so certainly the challenge with liability, and I think judges have struggled with this in the few cases where it has been brought up, is understanding what the prevailing standard of care is. That's, everybody knows that's been the big challenge. And I think that the things like Secure by Design framework. NIST was the NIST cybersecurity framework. All of these things, they don't provide quite the level of granularity that as a lawyer, as the regulatory counsel, you would really like, but it certainly gives us a starting point for understanding what are some of the basic things that a responsible player would do.
Okay. Any other questions there? Do we have? All right. Surely we have another question in the audience somewhere. Come on, don't be afraid. Thank you.
Thanks so much for a great presentation. You talked a little bit about the tensions for businesses around being transparent. There's a lot of government experience on the panel, and there is a tension within government as well, especially adversarial and defensive tensions around what do we release about vulnerabilities. And I wonder if you could speak to progress around that tension.
Absolutely.
Good question.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And as one of the people who helped bring the current vulnerabilities equities process sort of forward, you're right, there is a tension there. And this gets at a point that Eric was making, though, which is that the government has multiple roles. There are pieces of the government that are responsible for conducting intelligence operations, conducting military operations, conducting law enforcement operations, and we, as a society, want them to be successful, right? We want our intelligence agencies to collect the intelligence about actors that mean us harm so that we get them and collect and stop them before they cause us that harm, right? We want law enforcement to be able to stop and arrest, prosecute criminals. So we need those capabilities. We want those capabilities. At the same time, different parts of government are responsible for protecting infrastructure and helping to protect the country. And so there is never going to be a clear black and white answer that will simply apply to every situation. And so what you want is you want a government to have a process, and I would argue that all governments should have this process, by which they actually bring together those multiple perspectives, which, because we're Washington, D.C., and we like to use strange words, we call those equities. So what we mean by vulnerabilities equities process is actually bringing together all those different perspectives across government, all those different equities that those participants have in that process to make a judgment about how we actually disclose vulnerabilities that the government finds during the course of its work. And then you set up a couple of rules to actually structure the process. So you say, all right, the default position is going to be, the default assumption is we're going to disclose everything we find. So if you want to keep a vulnerability secret, you got to prove why that's a good idea, right? And then you say...
This is obviously with respect to vulnerabilities that the government has found, as
yes.
opposed to been told about by others.
That's a completely separate process. This deals with the stuff that we find. And then you say, and that decision to keep it secret is not going to be for forever. We're going to actually revisit it. And if something has changed, we're going to revisit it periodically. And if something has changed, if there's now a whole bunch of researchers out there that are starting to find that same types of vulnerabilities, then we're actually going to change our decision. And so that's how you actually build responsible processes for managing that tension. And what I would argue is that every government faces that tension, even if they pretend that they don't. And so what you really want is more governments to actually build the capability to manage that process in an effective manner. Now that's different than vulnerabilities that governments get told about, and there you want to promote the transparency processes that Eric has been talking about. And at the end of the day, this is a judgment call. And there's no getting around the fact that it's going to be a judgment call at the end of the day.
And let me just double click on the point that Suzanne and Michael both just emphasized, which is to note that when a researcher or vendor discloses a vulnerability to the US government, those vulnerabilities are released publicly every single time. That is an entirely separate process from the process that Michael described about vulnerabilities that the government itself finds in the first instance.
And again, I think one of the things that the government thinks about when it thinks it has discovered a vulnerability that nobody else maybe knows about is, can they use it to learn important information, from the networks and systems of our adversaries, right? And so, as Michael says, these are really important equities that are brought to the table. When I was at the table, I would always push people to think about how little time they have, if any, in which they have a monopoly on that information. You should always push yourself to assume this information is public, is known at least by our adversaries. If you have found it, think about the economic incentive our adversaries, criminals, nation-state actors have to find those vulnerabilities. What are the odds that they are not going to have found that and begin to exploit it quickly? And that has to be just because your instinct is to think, oh, I've got something precious, I'm going to hold on to it and use it as long as I can. And it's just so dangerous.
So that concludes the panel. So I'd like to thank everybody for their time. So Suzanne, Eric, and Michael, thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. We're almost at the end now. Stay hydrated. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.